This is part 2 of how to make a tiered or layered clamshell box. Part 1 focused on the pull-out tray, and this part will focus on the clamshell trays and the final case. Now, this part can get a little confusing because there's lots of different pieces that we have to cut, so I tried to make this really simple 3D model to kind of visually explain the things that we're going to be doing. So the first thing that we're going to be doing is cutting the 2 light blue pieces. The 2 light blue pieces are similar to what we did at the beginning with taking measurements of the book, but this time we are going to measure the tray we just finished making to make a base for the bottom and middle layer of the clamshell. These 2 pieces will be the length and width of the tray we just made, plus a few millimeters to each dimension to account for the thickness of the covering material. In my opinion, it's better to make this a little too loose than a little too tight, because if it's too tight, you won't really be able to pull the tray in or out. Once we've cut those 2 light blue pieces, we want to move on to the 2 dark green pieces on the short edge. So I'm going to go ahead and measure the total thickness of the first tray that we just made, plus the thickness of the 2 light blue pieces, plus the thickness of the book that will sit on top. And this is just to get the overall length, or however tall we need to make the sides of the clamshell enclosure. And to err on the side of caution, I personally add an extra millimeter or 2 to this height just to ensure the walls will be tall enough. And this is where lining up your pieces as you go can come in handy, because I realized I cut the short edges a little too short, so I had to redo those pieces. At the same time that I'm recutting those dark green pieces, I'm also going to measure and cut the back light green piece, and the light green piece height is the same as those dark green pieces, and then this part's length is the light blue pieces plus 2 bookboard thicknesses. I unfortunately forgot to film me cutting the dark blue pieces, but this will just help support the divider between the top and bottom piece by giving the middle divider some extra bookboard to grab onto with the glue. And this piece length is the same as the dark green wall, and its height will be the same as whatever object or book you want to put on top. And with all the pieces cut, we can finally start building the clamshell enclosure. This construction will start off the same as a normal clamshell box, and kind of like what we did in part 1 with the pull-out tray, with gluing the base to some heavier cardstock or paper to add additional support for the walls. And then I'm going to glue the short edges first, and then I'm going to glue the long edge and leave everything to dry. Now I am just cutting off that spare or excess cardstock. Once that has finished drying, I'm going to take those 2 dark blue pieces we cut earlier and glue them to the top of the walls. I totally could have done this before I glued everything together, I just didn't think about it, and honestly it's probably easier if you glue it together before the clamshell box is halfway constructed. And for now, the last part I need to glue is the second light blue piece we cut, so I'm just going to flip the clamshell tray over and glue that additional piece onto the tray, and once again let everything dry. Before I start covering everything in book cloth, I'm just going to do a test fit to make sure everything fits and that everything is the correct dimension. And if it is, I can move on to covering it with book cloth. Covering the walls is similar to what we did in part 1 with covering the tray, so I'm first going to take a strip of book cloth long enough to wrap around the clamshell walls with an extra centimeter or 2 for turn-ins, and then similar to the tray we made at the beginning, this strip of book cloth also needs to be tall enough to fold over the walls of the clamshell tray. And once again, as I'm gluing, I am cutting straight lines out from the edge of the tray to the end of the book cloth just to make wrapping easier, and then also using my bone folder as I go to smooth out any bubbles or wrinkles. The part of clamshell boxes that confuses me every single time is cutting a small strip of cloth on the corner of the board so that the board corner won't poke through after we have covered everything. On a normal clamshell, you make that cut that is about a bookboard thickness away from the edge, but I wasn't paying attention and didn't account for the extra thickness for the top layer of our tray, and I fixed this later on by cutting a small strip of book cloth of the correct thickness and just gluing that on. Then I'm making a few more cuts at the opening of the clamshell enclosure just to make wrapping the book cloth easier. And yes, the bookboard was very warped. That's why grain direction is important, but I was able to flatten it out by pressing it under some heavy weights. And doing exactly what we did with the pull-out tray in part 1, I'm just going to miter these bottom turn-ins and then glue them down to the bottom of the box. I also make sure to miter all of the corners on the front of the box just by overlapping the book cloth and making a little cut. On the short edges of the tray, I am just going in and cutting out a long strip of cloth from that little cut to the end of the book cloth. And then on the long edge of the tray, I am just going in and cutting out that little triangle. And this is once again just to help us fold over the cloth more easily and make sure everything is covered without being too bulky. And this is the part that I accidentally messed up earlier. That little strip of cloth should have been 2 bookboard thicknesses to account for that extra bookboard we added just to support the middle divider, but I had only made it 1. So I just went ahead and cut off a small strip that was the correct width and just glued that to the corner and the edges just to make sure that when we fold over all of the cloth, that little corner won't peek through. Since this tray is divided, we need to cut into these short edges just so once again the cloth can fold more easily, and to do this I line up a piece or 2 of scrap board to know when to stop cutting, and then from that piece of board dividing the tray I will cut straight down the book cloth, making sure not to cut above the line that I had made with those spare pieces of bookboard. And then an extra precaution I take is similar to what we did with those front corner edges. I'm just taking a strip of book cloth the width of a bookboard and just gluing that down to that little intersection just to make sure that everything will be covered and no bookboard will be poking through. Now I'm finally at a point where I can start gluing down the turn-ins, and that is what you see me doing here. Once all the walls have been glued down, I need to measure and cut the pieces of book cloth that will cover the top of the clamshell enclosure and then kind of the front edges. So I go ahead and measure and cut those out. Now I am just gluing those pieces of cloth onto the clamshell enclosure. With everything dried, I'm just going to do another test fit just to make sure everything fits and that tray can pull in and out easily. And I'm gonna speed over making and covering of the second clamshell tray a bit just because it is a more straightforward version of the tray we just made. The important thing is to use the first clamshell's tray's measurements to determine this tray's length, width, and height, and then cover accordingly. Now I am just gluing the base of the tray down onto that thick paper and then adding the walls. Then I will wrap the walls of the second clamshell tray in the exact same manner that I did the first one. After that, I go in and miter the bottom turn-ins, and then I miter the turn-ins on the front or the top of the clamshell tray. And just like we did the first time, I am going in and gluing the book cloth down over the walls of the clamshell tray. I still need to cover the top of the clamshell tray, so I'm just going in and cutting out a piece of cloth to the appropriate size and gluing that down, making sure to smooth out any bubbles or wrinkles in the cloth with a bone folder. At this point, we are so close to the end. The last thing we need to make is the case for the trays to sit in, and this is actually very, very straightforward because it's almost the same process as making a case for a book, but instead the trays are kinda our text block. So I go in and cut out 2 pieces of board for the front and back covers with 3mm squares. This means I take the length and width of the larger tray and I add 6mm to the length and 3mm to the width. And then I also cut the spine piece to the appropriate size. Instead of using the T-spacers I normally would when I'm rebinding a book, I am creating my own with a spare piece of book board that's the same thickness as the front and back covers and the spine piece, and I am gluing 2 layers of book cloth over that just to create the appropriate thickness, because I will be gluing the turn-ins kind of into this hinge, so I want to make sure the hinge is not too tight. And here you can see me using that hinge spacer I made. And then just like I would for a normal rebind or making a hardback book, I'm just going to trim the turn-ins, miter the corners, and then glue everything down. Now I've already measured it out, but I measured and cut out a piece of book cloth that will extend 2 or 3 centimeters onto the front and back cover from the spine piece, and I gently work this into the hinges. And this is also why we wanted to wrap 1 or 2 layers of book cloth around that spare book board hinge we made, just to account for the extra thickness we are adding in this step. With the case made, we can now glue the trays onto the case, so I'm going to start with the larger tray and glue that onto the case. And I also make sure to place both trays right up against that inside edge of the front and back cover board, close to the spine piece without going over the hinge. Then I will just use some heavy weight to press that tray into the case as it dries. And lastly, I glue in the smaller tray, or the one that has the divider between the top and the bottom. And with everything assembled, you can now decorate the case however you want. In my case, I am just going to be using some heat transfer vinyl. And that is how I make a layered or tiered clamshell case with a pull-out tray. I don't think there is any official or proper name for this, so I've just been calling it the layered or tiered clamshell. And I hope you found this 2-part series helpful.